Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren. I am the chief economist here at American Compass. And what better week than the week of the China tariff showdown, negotiation, revision, reduction, to talk about Apple in China. Apple in China is a new book out by Patrick McGee, who is the Financial Times' San Francisco reporter. And he joined us for just a fascinating conversation about, Apple, the corporation's experience in China as really a microcosm for a lot of what has happened with globalization over the past few decades. And in particular, as he distinguishes very helpfully, the difference between globalization and Chinafication, as Apple sort of illustrates in what went from a global supply chain to an incredibly China-centered one, really in response to a lot of Chinese industrial policy and really with the effect of transferring little by little all of the expertise over to a Chinese industry that now leads not just in telecom, but in things like batteries and electric vehicles. So a really interesting story from both the business and economic side, the policy side, and the technology side, and just a fascinating conversation. So stick around for that. Got to tell you about what's going on at Commonplace. We've been looking at the trade issue and the tax issue this week. On the trade side, Michael Pettis made his debut for us, looking at the downside of capital flows. Michael McNair also on capital flows and thinking about how regulating of them can reshape our economy. And then on the tax side, Henry Olsen with, I thought, a really good piece on the Grover Norquist narrative of tax increases, and particularly the old George H.W. Bush read my lips tax increase. Was that actually a political liability or not? Trump himself has obviously weighed in on this, and Henry, I think, is the ultimate observer of how these trends have affected conservative politics over time. Patrick Brown on why we need to invest in family-friendly infrastructure as well. And of course, if you are not already subscribed to Understanding America, we are talking about all these things there as well. I had a piece up on Monday. No, I guess this was our special Tuesday edition of Understanding America, looking just at the question of certainty and uncertainty and what businesses have any right to expect when they try to do business in China. So subscribe for that at understandingamerica.co. And last but not least, this month you also have to hear me talk about The New Conservatives, the book out from American Compass. Coming June 3rd is an anthology for our 5th anniversary of really a lot of our best stuff from our first 5 years. So hope you will consider picking that up. But in the meantime, enjoy this conversation with Patrick McGee. Patrick McGee, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Oren. Thrilled to be here.
We are thrilled to have you. If ever there were a week to be talking about trade with China, this would appear to be it. And if there's ever a company to talk about trading in China, I suppose it would be Apple. I guess there's the sort of generic, why did you write a book about Apple in China question? So let me put a slight spin on it, which would be, how much of the story of Apple at this point do you think really is a story about China?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I mean, I think its fate is completely bound with China's. And, well, obviously we'll get into this. We've got lots of time. But, I mean, the degree to which all roads lead through China, and then most roads are in China for the supply chain, is actually understated. Like, even when people are saying 90% of production is in China, like, I think that's actually understating things. And the idea that they can do some quick move to India, which has convinced lots of lay people, but experts know that this is nonsense. I mean, China just means everything, because if I was talking about this in 2010, well, maybe I wouldn't have the same view. I mean, the statistics would be similar in how much was in China. But you'd say, okay, but what really makes this company thrive is the DNA of Steve Jobs and the designs of Johnny Ive. And this is a time, if I'm 2010, that we're reinventing the phone every year. And so like industrial design, product design, that's really driving the company. But this is a company that's been led by an operations chief since 2011, Tim Cook. Well, what's operations? Well, that's everything that's in China. Johnny Ive has left the company. The iPhone, your listeners may have noticed, does not get reinvented every year to the same degree. It gets a better battery life, the cameras improve, but it's not like it's a triangle next year. You know, we sort of are reached saturation of sort of what the iPhone can do, and then it's just improvements on the margins. So, you know, through that lens, the importance of operations and therefore the importance of China is more and more paramount.
Yeah, it's a fascinating point about Apple that for a period there was every year or two, the developer conference, there was some mind-blowing new device, way of interacting with technology. I guess that hasn't been the case in a long time. There's a set of attempted projects and not very successful projects, but is it really the iPad the last time you sort of had a new device
I
or
was going to
vertical?
say,
Maybe the
it depends
watch?
if you count the Apple Watch and the AirPods. And you might not because they're iPhone adjacent, right? They're not really products on their own to the same degree that an iPad or an iPhone is. On the other hand, they sell them in such large numbers that I think I'm correct in saying Apple makes more money from AirPods than it ever did from the iPod.
Interesting.
Right? And considering what a cultural phenomenon the iPod was, that's a little bit mind blowing. So I wouldn't discount how popular and lucrative both the Apple Watch and the AirPods are. The Vision Pro, on the other hand, is a bit of a disaster. I gave the Vision Pro an immensely positive review when I did my first demonstration of it. Maybe just for the audience, the Vision Pro is their attempt at a headset. It costs $3,500. What it is capable of is phenomenal. What it actually does, if you buy the thing, as frankly I did, is pretty weak. I mean, they just haven't developed any content for it. I mean, not to go off on some tangent, but technologically, they could set you game courts. What am I trying to say? Courtside at the Warriors playoff games. My home team. And you could watch through the Vision Pro, and it would genuinely feel like you would quantum leapt into the body of someone that's there. That's phenomenal. But for the life of me, I don't know why they haven't actually done that. Like you can't do that, but you might be able to in a few years. So maybe there's some hope there. But the Vision Pro obviously is not a success so far, and even more conspicuous would be the Apple Car, which we've never even seen a prototype for, and they've abandoned. But they spent 10 years trying to build that up.
Right. And I think this is a sort of fascinating microcosm of what has happened in U.S. industry and technology generally in the era of globalization. And I really like the distinction you make in the book that, particularly in electronics, it's not globalization, it's Chinafication. And so I suspect we will end up back here where we've started at the question of, well, what does this do to a company? What does this do to an industry? But let's go back to the start of the road that led there, because one interesting thing about the book is, in a sense, it takes a long time to get to China, right?
Yes.
I mean, Apple has gone through these different eras. I don't think we need to go all the way back necessarily to the Mac SE and so forth. But if we start, let's say, around the mid '90s. What was the journey? I mean, Apple at one point was making its own products. Give people a sense of how the company evolved from its prior version to the one that was so entangled with China.
I mean, Apple will turn 50 next April. And the first 25 years is really the era in which they do manufacture their own computers, right? So, I mean, the basic gist of Apple is it's founded by two guys named Steve in a garage in 1976. Globalization of electronics, especially of computers, really doesn't exist at that stage. The way I put it is that if you've got a garage-sized computer from IBM, that is not going to make any economical sense to make it somewhere in Asia and then ship them over en masse. Obviously, that's not going to make any sense. So Moore's law really drives what's possible with the evolution of the supply chain and the development of the supply chain. So, I really give a lot of credit to the IBM PC in 1981 because I have this anecdote where Steve Jobs dissects a PC, right? Apple's sort of maybe not the ruling company, but they're the most innovative company in the early 80s building computers. And this is before they've come out with the Macintosh and the graphical user interface, but they're still a very creative company. Steve Jobs is a young millionaire, et cetera, very confident. And IBM is the world's biggest tech company and basically has been for decades. And they decided to get into the PC business. So Steve Jobs opens up the PC, tries to look at how it's configured, and realizes there's nothing there. There's certainly nothing that we can't do. And he's right, except that he misses the picture, that IBM has just launched a battle on it's launched a war on a battle that Apple wasn't prepared for. Apple thought IBM might come out with something that they couldn't match, that it was just so technologically layers above Apple that they would struggle to compete. And instead, they bandaged a computer together based on existing parts. And the reason I'm driving home this point is because those existing parts can be made anywhere. So the IBM PC ends up being this huge catalyst for outsourcing and for electronics component manufacturing, not all over the world because you don't really have them coming out of South Africa or something, but for East Asia in particular, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Taiwanese, they all get involved in building components and especially circuit boards. And once they start doing that, they sort of take it the next step further and they begin assembling computers, designing computers, and then competing with their Western counterparts. So IBM really is like the catalyst for globalization. And then I compare it to the 2007 iPhone, which is really the catalyst for Chinafication, because Apple is not working with components that you could find in other phones. It's basically doing proprietary processes. And once you're at the volume of doing this in 100 million a year, 200 million a year, and you're running just-in-time manufacturing at really high quality levels, it is going to make zero sense to have a supply chain based on different time zones and different islands and bodies of water between them in hoping everything arrives at the exact time. So they need to consolidate into one country, and China just has the combination of cost, and they don't really have skill. We'll come back to that, but the combination of cost, abundant, even desperate, quite frankly, labor, and a government that will just tailor make policies and allow, without environmental regulation, like buildings to just be put up in such a time frame that were you doing the same project in Texas, you wouldn't have the environmental bylaws passed by the time the building was actually up and running in China.
Yeah, the why China question, it has so many answers that you've just sort of run through to some extent. But backing up a second, even when you're talking about IBM and all of its various components, the initial question is sort of why Asia? Because of course Silicon Valley is called Silicon Valley because it used to be where the silicon, not the silicon got made, but the silicon got made into stuff.
Yeah.
And I think there's sort of one mental model of globalization that says, well, the high-tech stuff is the stuff that the U.S. should still do. Now, a circuit board isn't necessarily high-tech per se, but what was it that made the U.S. not the place where you would make any of these
So,
things?
to be fair, the U.S. originally was where
Right.
this stuff was being built. But it's because IBM and then, of course, the PC clones who all just replicate what IBM has done, that's what gives rise to the idea that this stuff can be built anywhere. Because when Compaq, Gateway, HP, Dell are all doing what IBM is doing, what's fascinating about that and why it plays such a role for globalization is they're all doing the same thing, right? If in 1989 you had a Dell, I had an HP, and our neighbor had a Gateway, it wouldn't matter. We would all be running Windows. We're all running on Intel chips. And none of the companies were putting an iota of thought into the design. I mean, they would literally all be beige. They would look about the same. And the components would be made by the same companies, or at least similar companies. In fact, they might have even been made in the same factory in the same way and just badged differently. So it's the Taiwanese, for instance, that really take advantage of their lower cost to basically compete on the same components that were originally being built in America. And because computers begin to be so popular, you can do this at big scale. Components aren't like mainframe computers, right? You can ship them, across the ocean in 30 days. And so someone like Terry Guo, who founds Foxconn, literally travels 30 different states in America in the early 1980s, basically saying, give me a chance. And so not only is he operating on razor thin margins, but he's using a labor base that, of course, is probably be 1/5, if not 1/10, if not 1/20th, the labor costs that America has. So Asia just begins to win more and more orders, even if the brand name is associated with an American company. And indeed, the profit associated with an American company. I mean, there's a reason why it's fantastic to off-source and offshore your operations, because if you're Dell, if you're HP, the idea of paying fixed costs at a time when you don't need the computers being built is a bad idea if someone says, I will offer you manufacturing as a service and you will only pay for what you need when you need it. And by a company doing that and having all sorts of clients, they can shuffle their own workers around at a way that's far more economical than one single company ever could.
And I guess you're still left with the question, and sorry, this is one that just fascinates me about, okay, but you, in theory, you could have done that same model in the US somewhere. You could imagine a giant Texas Foxconn.
Yeah.
And the reasons you're sort of describing, well, okay, but a Texas Foxconn is never going to compete with a Taiwanese or a Shenzhen Foxconn. In part, it's things like the environmental regulations and so forth. But then that labor cost point in a sense, it comes down to not just that the labor is cheaper, but in a sense that it's more exploitable. In that, if you
Agreed.
actually had to pay the workers, proportionate to how productive they were, it wouldn't help you to move to the lower cost country if it was also lower productivity. The secret sauce is that you're getting productivity that looks much closer to American productivity at a fraction of the cost. And, I think you highlight this specifically in the China context where, this is active government policy to deliver this. Was that a strategy in Asia generally, do you think, or was it that really something that came along more with China in particular?
So let me back up a little bit, just because I think you're sort of nailing the question on the head with what about if Foxconn was in Texas? And the sort of progenitor to Foxconn is actually a company called Spacecraft Incorporated, okay, known as SCI. They're founded after Soviets launched Sputnik, and they begin making satellites. And they have a role in the, what's it called, the Saturn V rocket that goes to the moon. And as the sort of military-industrial complex sort of builds, they begin taking orders to do the whole production. So, in other words, SCI begins as a supplier of components and satellites and things like that. But eventually they turn to becoming what I think of as the first electronics contract manufacturer, where they're not playing any role in the design, but they will take someone's blueprint and they will design it for you. IBM essentially catches wind of this. In particular, they have this advanced way of doing circuit boards. I mean, at a time when literally Steve Jobs' pregnant sister was putting circuit boards together by hand, SCI comes around with a pioneering automated method to do it. And IBM takes advantage of this, and IBM begins to outsource not just the circuit board, but the whole computer to SCI. So this is the closest thing you're going to find to Foxconn in Texas, which is that SCI is the world's largest contract manufacturer at the turn of millennium. I think they have 30,000 people at the time in 16 countries or something. And so it's actually the PC boom is really run by a bunch of companies that few people have ever heard of, Selectron, Celestica, Jabil, and these are the winners. The companies you haven't heard of are all the companies that led to the mergers of these companies. And they are like an M&A banker's dream in the 90s because they're just all kinds of mergers and acquisitions, because all they're fighting for is how do we do this more efficiently and at lower cost. And there's something, I want to say around 1992, it's called the Compaq shock. And it's when Compaq dramatically reduces the price of their computers. And of course, if you're an American consumer, you love this. I mean, it's something like 20 or 30% less than what everyone else is doing. And the reason they had accomplished it is they had gone into Asia at a time when the others hadn't really done it. And so that's basically what happened. So you have the supply chain competition among these assembly giants, and they've got disparate operations. And when they're competing with each other, it's they that move over to Asia. And worth knowing, Apple isn't doing this. Apple is not really working with contract manufacturers in the 80s and 90s. I'll give an asterisk that's explained in the book. That's a whole chapter. But for the most part, they are not. And that's what leads them to near bankruptcy in 1996. They're being outcompeted.
Right. And Apple's reputation was it was more bespoke, but also a lot more expensive for, at the end of the day, roughly the same.
Yeah. And that, I guess just to go full circle on the narrative, what happens is Apple loses its lead in the graphical user interface as soon as Windows 95 comes out, because at that point, nothing you're really wanting to do on a Mac can't be replicated on a Windows PC, and the price differential that you're paying for a Mac ceases to make any sense.
And so fast forward then to the Apple move. So Apple is still kind of doing its own thing, and it's not very successful financially until you get to, I don't know if it's the iPod or not, until the iPhone. Now you have this sort of entirely new device, new set of components, all designed in-house, and they have to figure out how to actually make this thing.
Yeah. So when Apple finally, I mean, you know what the standard thing for a product is that we say about Apple, right? I'm saying a cliche here, is that Apple didn't invent the MP3 player. It didn't invent the smartphone, but when it did it, it was just better than everybody else, right? Mm-hmm. That, in a nutshell, is what happens for the supply chain. In other words, Apple doesn't lead the idea of going to Asia. It certainly doesn't lead the idea of going to China. It is late to both of these trends. But when it does it better than anybody else. So the likes of Dell, when they go to China in the early 2000s, it's because they see margin and they see cost savings that they can pass on to their consumers. So they just see, high volumes and a workforce that can put things together cheaply. Apple looks at China differently, and they realize instead of making sort of like a beige box computer, we can design something that's insane and that we wouldn't actually be able to build ourselves. But if you have armies of workers being paid 50 cents an hour just performing the most minute tasks, they will be able to put together whatever it is the Johnny Ive studio comes up with. And so that's sort of how the translucent iMac and then the iMac G4, which is sort of this thing that looks like a sunflower, that's how China sort of comes into being. Because I tell this 7-year narrative where Apple's experimenting on 3 continents with contract manufacturers here, there, everywhere. And it's really failing. But the company that's sort of playing a role on the side is Foxconn. And they're building in Czech Republic, California, and in China. And the more that you're comparing what each of those facilities is capable of, the more the Chinese narrative is just making better business sense. And I should say, like, moral sense is the wrong way to put it. But an amoral sense in a way. Like in the Czech Republic, the problem is that the media covers the working conditions. The workers protest about the idea of building dormitories where they're going to be housed, right? So like China just wins out for a bunch of reasons that you could call unethical or what have you, but you begin to have a mass of consolidation into China. And so that's sort of I think that fits in pretty well with the standard narrative. I don't think people are aware of just how much experimentation there was. I mean, you noticed, wow, your book takes a long time to get into China, right? I mean, there's this whole section called The Long March to China. And in a sense, I'm trying to handhold the reader that, yep, we're going to get there. It's going to take a while. Then the other thing, and this is probably the most novel part of the narrative, is I'm explaining the role of the manufacturing design engineer. These are the people living in California who take what Johnny Ive has done, and it's their role to go to suppliers across Asia, locate them, find them, and then train the hell out of them because they're not capable of what Johnny Ive has conceived of. They can't make it. They don't have the skill sets. But the engineers in California either do or they will, die trying kind of thing. But they do so by finding these suppliers, seeing what is possible, and then they train, audit, supervise, co-create all these processes. So it's not just they're coming up with new parts; they're coming out with like the machine that builds the machine, right? The production line, and then it gets thrown over the fence to the operations team, who then replicates every inch of that line and scales and scales and scales. So my point is, there's this huge missing narrative that my book fills the hole for of how Apple doesn't just find competence in China, it builds that competence in China. So I'm not just saying they're stuck, I'm saying they're stuck in China, but they're stuck on capabilities that they created there. I don't think anybody has really dug deep into that topic before. It's pretty novel.
No, I'm glad you highlighted that because the manufacturing design engineer is, in a sense, it's in my mind sort of the missing link in an anthropological sense.
Yes.
For what happens to innovation generally. I mean, and you also kind of described this a few minutes ago when you were saying, I'm not going to get exactly right, but first they made the circuit boards, then they start doing the actual processes, then they start doing the design. Pretty soon they're making everything there.
Yes.
And that process, it's something we obsess about at American Compass in trying to emphasize that the reason you care about manufacturing at all is because at the end of the day, the innovation follows the manufacturing.
Shop floor innovation.
Right. Designed in California, made in China is kind of a nice concept, but at some point, those manufacturing, the design engineers transfer that expertise. Pretty soon, virtually the entire process is best done in China, at which point, if you're Apple, you still have an awful lot of IP to make money off of, but a lot more of the value add ends up on the other side of the Pacific.
And I would put one pushback, which is that I don't know that the value add is there. In other words, you actually don't tend to have Chinese companies that are making enormous profit from this. But the reason why I'm highlighting this is because this is another facet that people miss, because they say, well, the profit's being made by NVIDIA, by Apple, so what's the problem? Right? This is the golden age where we're doing all the software and the design, and the Chinese companies basically do it on the cheap. Okay, the reason they do it on the cheap is because their goal is not distribute to shareholders. Their goal is to become so advanced in these things that every other country becomes deindustrialized and they're the only shop in town to do it. So the best example, if we just leave the smartphone aside, is solar panels, right? Invented in, I think, 1954 by America. I think we have 90% market share by the 1980s. Today we have 3% market share. And the Chinese companies aren't, the big Fortune 500 titans that you could name, but they sure have taken over that market. And maybe they're not making margin, but they're making volume.
Right.
And we could get to a stage where we have no idea how to build this anymore. We're certainly not doing the innovation to make them better and better, and the Chinese can do all of it. So that's just a multi-decade example where we've completely lost capacity to do something that we invented, and we've just sort of gifted it to the Chinese. And that's actually the story I'm trying to tell. I'm just doing it through the sex appeal of Apple designs. But you could sort of copy and paste this narrative to varying degrees to all sorts of sectors.
Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, electric vehicles is another, I think, obvious one where we've seen it happen over the last 10 or 15 years.
Yes, smartphone on wheels.
Increasingly it is, in fact, the smartphone makers making the...
And it's not a coincidence. You know, one of the things I really try to point out is that Apple deliberately pays its suppliers very little. And you'd think, well, why do the suppliers put up with it? They put up with it because Apple is training the hell out of them. So basically, instead of thinking they're getting low margin, they're thinking, oh, we're actually getting a free Ivy League tuition in how to build stuff. So there have been real champions made in China, Chinese companies basically made under the tutelage of Apple engineers. You could even say under the tutelage of America's best engineers, because, you know, B students aren't going to Apple. Apple can hire the best. They can take them away from SpaceX and Tesla and Dell and Motorola, and they can get them out of Stanford and Caltech. And I can't tell you how many people, when their first day of Apple, they show up and they say, what do I do? They say, here's your flight to China. You know, good luck out there, right? I mean, they're just taking the skills and then they're transferring them to China. And I should say, it's not just a story of American ingenuity going over to China, because Apple has these subject matter experts whose specific role is scour the world, go to Japan, go to Switzerland. How are Rolexes made, right? How are little tiny knobs on watches made? And can we use that technology for the iPhone, right? So they are taking the best stuff coming out of the countries with the most automation, signing little private deals with these companies, and then scaling it in China. Now, obviously, in retrospect, there is a massive technology transfer here because the suppliers learn how to do this. Well, what do they do with it? I mean, the most obvious thing to do is that you go to the companies in China that are most like Apple, Huawei, Oppo, Vivo, Xiaomi, and you supply them the same stuff. Now, maybe you do it at a year's lag, okay? But you'll notice that Chinese phones are really good at multi-touch. They're all rectangles with glass on them, right? So there's a reason why, like, BlackBerry isn't able to keep up, but Xiaomi is. And so my sort of killer line for the book is that the iPhone didn't kill Nokia. Chinese competitors to the iPhone killed Nokia. And the reason the competitors were so good was that Apple trained all of their suppliers. Right? So I call this the Apple squeeze. We're not going to pay you much, but we're going to train the hell out of you. Terry Guo gets it in 1999. A bunch of Chinese manufacturers get it in 2016. And what you've seen is the increasing like real estate within the iPhone shift from multinationals making in China to Chinese companies making in China. And I think there's been an extraordinary, epic transfer of knowledge from America and from around the world to the Chinese.
Right, and that gets into sort of the Faustian bargain and the sort of what Apple paid for this and what it now finds as its dependence as a result. I guess the one question before we sort of get into that, you know, okay, where are they now? What are the costs and so forth? Is how much did they understand at the time? Because you sort of said kind of, you know, in retrospect, and I think we're also seeing now in the context of the increasing trade tension, you know, this is something I was just writing about this week. At some point, businesses shouldn't be allowed to say, oh, wait, you know, what's happening? Things are getting disrupted. Businesses took a risk and made some great money for a while, and I would argue should be accountable for the downside also. But some of that comes down to what actually could have been known or understood. I mean, in 2000, every expert was saying China is going to liberalize, China is going to democratize, this is going to be great. How did Apple see it? What did they understand them, you know, to be accepting, to be giving up? And what did they just not think about? They were just trying to make cool phones.
So I can come back in a second to the political awakening that they experienced in 2013. But let me just first tell you my favorite quote in the book, because it was said to me by a former vice president at Apple over coffee. And he says, "Are you sure you're not overthinking your thesis? Because you keep telling me about geopolitics, but I can tell you, I was there when we built the supply chain in China in the early 2000s, and we weren't thinking about geopolitics at all." And the section just ends by me saying, precisely. Like that
Yeah.
in a nutshell is my thesis. Nobody's evil at Apple. I'm not saying anyone's unethical. They sleepwalked into a crisis. They were lured by the siren call of an emerging superpower who had a long-term plan, and they were thinking about a one-year plan.
And so does it, and you mentioned then kind of the awakening in 2013. Do you think is that the start of it? That's when people first realized maybe there's, at Apple anyway, hey, there might be more going on here?
Yeah, so Apple basically realizes that they're in way over their head in China. So I'll try to give you the quick and dirty narrative here, but there's a lot to unpack. And so if you want me to slow down on any of it, I could. The first Apple store is created basically exclusively for the Beijing Olympics in 2008. Nobody at Apple thinks it's going to make money. It's probably going to lose money, but it's going to be a great marketing effort. You're going to have lots of international people there, and they can get it, like, if they fast track it, it can be built and open days ahead of the Beijing Olympics. So sounds good. Might as well do it. It ends up doing really well. Such that by 2010, Apple has decided to build a few more stores. And 2010 is when the iPhone 4 comes out. The iPhone 4 is really a breakthrough. If your listeners are of a certain age and they remember their first iPhone, it's probably the iPhone 4.
Yeah.
I mean, this is when the volumes really become big. And like the chief designer of the phone said, he wanted it to be so smooth that people will think it was licked by 1,000 kittens. And he wanted the design to look like it had fallen from space. So, every other phone before had like an antenna embedded sort of in the beside the circuit board in the phone. They managed to get it in the chassis of the phone, which actually was a problem. This was what was it called? Antenna gate. But despite some short-term problems, it was a real breakthrough in the design and how it functioned and what it could do.
My
and
first
so forth.
iPhone was an iPhone 4.
I mean, exactly. I'm not shocked at all. The Chinese love this phone, okay? It just goes gangbusters. So it goes so gangbusters that these quasi-gangsters known as yellow cows, who basically exist to exploit differences between supply and demand, recognize that there's this enormous opportunity. And this is the most fascinating part of the book. It's sort of like thesis adjacent, and yet it's just so fascinating. So what ends up happening is they want to have 10,000 phones and go sell them in a city where there's no Apple store. But Apple's like, well, great, but you can buy two. Right, 2 per person. So they start bussing in migrants from outside Beijing, outside Shanghai. And so you literally have 4, 5, 6, 7,000 people outside the store for every launch, day after day, everybody buying 2 phones with the same wad of cash. Apple employees are responding, frankly, on a conveyor belt-like system, giving the product, counting giving them the change, making sure it's legit. And then the migrants are leaving the store and giving to someone holding a suitcase 2 phones. And once they've got enough, they're going to a city like you've never heard of, Chongqing, 32 million people, number of Apple stores, 0. And they're selling them at, such a margin that these yellow cows are making more money than Apple per iPhone. And think of how much money Apple was making.
Right.
So there's this crazy thing. Now, again, it's just so fascinating that I might as well just continue on the narrative here because it links up with the political awakening. What happens is the yellow cows get greedy and they start purchasing the phones from abroad. So they're going to Verizon, they're going to T-Mobile in like New York. Actually, the most popular places was Oregon because there's no sales tax there. And they are deliberately breaking them. So they smuggle them into China. And then they're zapping the processor, rendering it inoperable. But in doing so, they are sort of zapping the part of the phone that would tell you that this is a Verizon phone meant for America. So they're rendering it inoperable so that they can take it to the Genius Bar and say, hey, I just bought this phone and it's not working for me. And the Genius Bar is looking at it and being like, I can confirm this is a brand new phone. I don't know why the processor is zapped. And with their courteous service, they would just give a new phone to these migrants who are being controlled by these yellow cow quasi-gangsters, sort of like linked up with the Chinese mafia, the triad organizations. So this is where when Apple begins to realize this, they're in way over their head. There's nobody senior living in the country. They don't have a senior person managing government affairs. There's not a single vice president. And they're beginning to realize we don't understand Chinese culture. We don't understand this distribution issue. They think they can build more Apple stores in the country, but the Chinese aren't letting them. There's roadblocks are being put up. People don't like the competition. And so they have what ends up happening is they catch on to what's happening, and so they begin to refurbish the phones. So instead of me coming in or a migrant coming in and saying my phone is broken, I don't know why, and Apple giving you a brand new phone, they refurbish it. You end up having to wait. Now look, if your phone was broken, Oren, and someone said it's going to take me 2 weeks to fix it, it's like, it'd be frustrating, but it's a reasonable solution. But if your whole point is that a bus is waiting for you to go to Chongqing so you can sell these things, it needs to be in a sealed box. It needs to be a brand new phone. It needs to have an Apple receipt. So the yellow cows begin complaining to various officials. Apple is treating Chinese customers in an inferior way. They are refurbishing phones, whereas in the rest of the world, the warranty policy is that you get a new phone. So this makes its way up the political channels. And within 36 hours of Xi Jinping becoming president in March 2013, Apple is publicly attacked on CCTV. You could think of it as the CNN of China. And they think, well, wait a minute, our warranty policies are the same. Why are we being called out for these warranty differences? And there's like 3-week digital blitzkrieg because Apple basically thinks, well, this is just a misunderstanding. So they just apologize. Or they do not apologize. They say our warranty policies are the same wherever. So for 3 weeks, they're just really attacked to such an extent that they worry that they're going to be blacklisted in the country. Not an idle threat. Facebook is blacklisted. Google is blacklisted. And they've been knocking it out of the park in terms of China revenue. And of course, all of their production is there. So it's a really big deal. So Tim Cook does indeed apologize in Mandarin on China's Apple website. But the thing that no one's really understood is that the reason the CCTV was attacking Apple is because these yellow cow gangsters were complaining about the warranty policy. So this was covered internationally, but no one ever knew what is the warranty thing all about. And it's because of these gangsters.
So, I mean, one thing that strikes me about this is that a lot of the story generally of American companies in China has to do with their pursuit of the Chinese consumer market. And
yes.
If you wanted access to the market, you had to accept this and that and do all sorts of things. Here, it seems like Apple clearly was not focused on China as a consumer market, even as late as 2013. Is that fair, that they were just in it as the supply chain?
So, the reason they're producing in China in the early 2000s is it's a large country with depressed wages. So think of Steve Ballmer in 2007 laughing at the iPhone's $500 price and saying no one's going to buy that. Well, why would anyone buy it in China where wages are so much lower? I mean, it was totally reasonable for Apple to think we have a luxury product. There's not a big base of Chinese buyers that are going to buy this thing. So it's in 2010 when they're astounded by the level of demand. So I was able to get some internal documents where Apple is flummoxed because they have to demand forecast, right? This is one of their key tasks, to figure out where to allocate phones, how many, because they don't want people disappointed. And they're just doing basic things like per capita income, thinking that they're being clever by only using Beijing income so that you're not counting, sort of wide swaths of the rural countryside and things like that. And they're just getting it wrong all the time. There's just way more demand than any sort of statistics or economics would point you to. So they begin doing surveys of people in the store to figure out what's going on. They find a mailman who'd spent 30% of his annual salary buying an iPhone. And he says, when people see me with the iPhone, they don't just see a mailman. And this is sort of the mentality in China at the time. I mean, there's literally a case, widely written about in Chinese media, of somebody selling their kidney to buy an iPad and an iPhone. So he gets surgery in the black market and unfortunately suffers all sorts of complications from that. But this is the level of demand in China that Apple is dealing with. So 2010, not 2013, really is the time when China goes from being like a haven of low labor and abundant workforce to the second most important market for the iPhone after America. Totally unforeseen. They sort of succeed without really trying.
Interesting. So fast forward now to sort of closer to present day. So Apple has essentially become entirely dependent on Chinese ecosystem for its manufacturing.
Yes.
Increasingly, it is relying on China as its growth market for its products. This leaves the CCP obviously with an enormous amount of leverage. How has that played out? What is the price that Apple is paying and in return for what it has gotten?
I think it just puts Apple in a position where there's not a lot they can do in terms of, when the New York Times was going to be banned by the CCP on the iPhone, when Beijing wanted to ban VPNs on the iPhone, Apple doesn't have the political capital to say we're not following through with those requests. So that's really where there's a problem, because if everything is so dependent on China, you can't say to Beijing, I think we're going to take a different route here. We're going to go build this someplace else, right? It's like the metaphor about like a speedboat versus the Titanic in terms of, making a turn. Like Apple's supply chain is enormously complex. It would take 10 to 15 years, if you could do it at all, to replicate it somewhere like India. And during those 15 years, Apple would really like to still be producing in China, and they would very much like $70 billion a year from Chinese consumers. So that's what makes them so stuck. Because if they say, followed my advice, which really would be to sort of like untie the China knot by retying the knot, as it were, in a friendlier country like India or even better Mexico, just because of the sort of proximity to America and the fact that you'd get more intermediate goods trades there. Well, it's good advice, Patrick, except that Beijing has Apple over a barrel. So if they issue a press release saying we're going to do a lot more production in India, maybe the electricity of a couple factories goes out that day. And China doesn't have to say explicitly what's happening. They'll just put Apple engineers and Apple leadership in a position where they're thinking, is that why the electricity went out? Was it that India press release or not? And this is the sort of thing that was happening in 2013, 2014, where various things were happening to Apple's supply chain. And so they sort of had to come up with a narrative of how do we make officials in China and in the provinces understand, you don't understand. Stop looking at the public information of how low paid the workers are or how low margin the suppliers are. We are giving them tremendous education, and we are the force behind the rise of Huawei and Xiaomi and Vivo, et cetera. And so it's sort of been like Apple's been protected ever since they made it clear to Beijing, like literally by Tim Cook going to Zhongnanhai, the citadel of Chinese communist power, in 2016, and making it plain to them just how much they contribute to the country.
Is the untying, to your point, it would take time. Is it plausible from a technological perspective? I mean, I suppose anything you can build in one place, you can eventually build in another.
Sure.
Is it it's a 10-year crash program of developing these sort of capabilities from scratch in Mexico? What would it actually look like to do this?
Yeah, I mean, there's no guarantee that it could happen either, right? So I guess the thing that people don't quite understand, and I would include senior people at Apple, I don't think they quite get this, is that China cares about manufacturing like it cares about nothing else. So even though India superficially is similar in that it's low wages, there's 1.5 billion people, et cetera, China orchestrates things in a way that India just does not. So for instance, it's well known, hundreds of millions of people have gone from the rural hinterlands of China to cities like Shenzhen, Suzhou, and Shanghai, and they don't raise their kids there, but they work 12 hours a day in the factories and produce all sorts of things. But they're not allowed to raise their kids there, and then they go back. So this is called like the floating population. They're sort of moving from one area to the other, and within a year they might even be at several factories in different cities, sort of like going to where the demand is. So I can't say that's not possible in India, but what I could say is that there was a study of internal migration for 80 countries, and the 80th country was India. In other words, there is no culture in India, especially of young women, leaving their family home, going to some other state on the other side of the country and doing factory work, or even if it's a IT call work, like something that's more based in India. That doesn't happen. So I don't want to be put in the position of saying it can't happen. Of course it could. But Apple is a powerful company. It's not a nation state. It doesn't have the power to change culture and dictate how the Indian government should work. So it's an immense task. And the reason I focus on India, by the way, is that, I mean, again, like the density of population just isn't something Michigan or Pennsylvania has. And it's not even just the density, it's the dynamism of that population and the hardworkingness of that population. What they're not doing is working in a field for 14 hours a day. That's what makes you think factory work is good. Nobody in America would want to go do this stuff.
Certainly not the way it is done in these other places. I guess maybe then my last question is thinking about, there's obviously a big push for reshoring and reindustrialization in the United States. Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick had a quote, I think it was taken widely out of context. He was making the point that what is done by, screwing in screws by hand in China, yes, we want that done in America, but it would be done by machines, and the jobs are the people maintaining the machines. You could almost look at it as sort of an alternative universe where things had stayed in America and developed along those lines, or now if after the fact people are trying to figure out other ways to do it, is there a more capital intensive, highly automated approach to this stuff that is plausible, or did Apple land on the model it did because that's kind of the only way to do it?
So it's a great question, and I would love to leave you with a nice, happy, optimistic answer that gives the listener a little bit of hope as they carry on with their day. And I don't want to say it's impossible, but with current automation, it's not really possible. So I think one thing people don't get is like, yes, there are hundreds of thousands of people working at any given time on Apple products, and they're doing these really labor-intensive jobs. But anything that can be automated in the supply chain for Apple has been automated. Like there is cutting edge robotics, lights out factories working on iPhone production. So we're not talking like, why don't we just give up the labor model and do automation? Like that's already happening and already happened quite a while ago. So it's the combination of the two that makes China so good. The other answer is that even if that were possible, so much would still be dependent on China. In other words, it's the Chinese who have gone to Africa and mined all the relevant materials. And then where does the refinery take place? All of it is in China. So we're not doing any rare mineral refining in America. Or if we are, it hasn't improved in 10 years. And it's certainly not cutting edge and it's not happening in big numbers. Whereas in China, they have basically a monopoly on that. They basically have a monopoly on battery technology, not only just like how it's made, but the actual scaling of it. So even if you introduce more and more automation, it's not like, oh, great, we can just do closer to the consumer factories now, because even the experiential know-how, the capital machinery, and the fact that all the raw minerals are still controlled by China, whether it's in China or in Africa, we still have a massive sort of skills gap, quality gap, experiential gap to match China. And that's giving the credit that it could be automated, in more degrees than it can. And right. I don't know that it can be. So even the hypothetical scenarios of like, what if there's a major advance are still pessimistic. I mean, so I hate to say it, but if there was an easy way out for this, the book wouldn't be compelling because you would just say, oh, they're just going to do this. This doesn't exist.
Well, the book is incredibly compelling. It is. We've only scratched the surface of the anecdotes, the details. I think. What I love about it is it is such a perfect story in that every one of these examples, every detail is a microcosm of so many things going on in so many parts of the economy, so relevant to everything that's going on in our politics today. So thank you for everything you did to put together. It's an incredible piece of work, and thank you for joining us today.
All right. Cheers, Oren. Would love to hear what you hear, because I know you're more politically connected to certain facets of the Trump administration than I am. So if you ever hear that they're reading the book and they have a take on it, my God, please get in touch.
We will keep you posted, and we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass Podcast.